This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is Steven Pinker's manual, The Sense of Style. I have two experts that will be talking about its pros and cons. The conversation will begin in a moment. This will be sort of a debate, but not really a debate since most of the parties have similar opinions about Steven Pinker's The Sense of Style. Charlie Euchner is on the left and Alex Sheremet is on the right. Charlie wrote an article that I read in review of Steven Pinker's The Sense of Style, a book that came out a few years ago. And I'd like to give all of my guests a few minutes to introduce themselves before we dig in. So Charlie, if you could give me a little bit of background about yourself, what you do, what you write for, and how you came upon Pinker's book and your general overall impression of it.
Right. My current activities are focused on a small company that I have called The Elements of Writing. You can get it at theelementsofwriting.com. And with that, I've produced a number of books, some big, some small, offering guidance on people about how to write a book, how to write essays, how to write in business, how to do emails, all kinds of topics. And I just came out with a new book called Keep It Short. But in addition to doing the work on writing, seminars and coaching and books and videos and so forth, I also write other books on other topics. I am right now working on a book about Woodrow Wilson. I wrote a book about the civil rights movement called Nobody Turned Me Around. I've written books about baseball. And in my previous career as an academic, I wrote academic books, mostly on urban politics and public policy.
Alex Sheremet has been on the show a few other times on varied topics, from film criticism to the arts in general. So Alex, those who haven't seen you, can you give a little background about yourself and your opinion of Pinker's book?
Sure. So my name's Alex Sheremet. I've been involved in education since I was a teenager. I've tutored people on writing. These are both children and adults, things like business correspondence. I've had people come to me wanting to improve their fiction and so on and so forth. As far as my writing career, I'm the author of Woody Allen Reel to Reel, which is the biggest analysis of Woody Allen's film art published to date. I've written novels, I've written poetry, essays, and pretty much everything between. So when I came across A Sense of Style, I was both intrigued and a little bit alarmed because although Steven Pinker has always struck me as a good academic style writer, he's not exactly a kind of stylist. And he's never really written or discussed the arts in any great depth before. So knowing how kind of out of their depth most people are when it comes to discussing art, I sort of expected the book to not be very good, and my view came to be justified. I think the main flaw in the book is it's basically two things. Number one, it has this pretense to doing more than what is in fact possible. When it comes to any kind of style guide, I feel like the number one thing that a style guide ought to do is it needs to bring the world's sub-mediocrities into the realm of mediocrity. This may sound kind of harsh, but really it's a good goal, because there's nothing wrong with establishing a kind of baseline. There's nothing wrong with establishing a kind of clarity when it comes to communication. But that's a wildly different thing from actually turning a mediocre writer to a good one, which is what Steven Pinker attempts to do. The second problem is when he does in fact try to give examples of good writing, when he does try to get into the nitty-gritty, when he does analyze the four texts that he finds to be just superbly written, they're actually ranging from bad to mediocre. There's nothing supernal about the writing, as he claims, and it really casts doubt on the remainder of the book. The unfortunate thing is these four passages come at the very beginning, and ultimately, if you start in a way where you just completely strike out, you can't really take the rest of the text seriously.
Well, before we get into Pinker's book specifically, let's just talk about the idea of writing manuals in general. Over the course of the last few centuries, probably going back to Dr. Johnson, there were things like the MLS manual, a Chicago manual style, Strunk in White. And it strikes me that all great writers that I've ever read, whether it's prose, poetry, playwriting, one of the things that separates a great writer is their very individuation, i.e., you can't mix up Emily Dickinson with Wallace Stevens. You can't mix up David Mamet with, George Bernard Shaw. And manuals, by their definition, almost always seek a formula to writing. And this seems antithetical to good writing. Charlie, your essay was called "The Mighty Pinker Strikes Out" here, basically, or "The Mighty Pinker Has Struck Out," and I'll link to that in Alex's essay and also your website that you mentioned just before as well below this video. So let me ask you: do you think that the very idea of manuals of style to improve writing are antithetical to writing well?
Yeah, no, absolutely not. I think when they're done correctly, and I've tried to do it myself, so you can judge yourself, and maybe we'll talk about that another time. But when they're done correctly, when they're done with a kind of logic and with a kind of modesty that I think you're calling for, they can be very helpful. I think there's kind of, you have to have a philosophy of writing. You have to have a deep understanding of what writing is, how it differs from other communication, what the basic building blocks are, and then you get to the style. I think Pinker went at it the other way. He started with style without any real foundation, and so that's why he struck out. But if you start with the basics, if you start by talking about, okay, what makes a great sentence, or what makes a great paragraph, or what are the basic shapes of the overall composition, if you start with those basics, that doesn't mean everybody's going to write great sentences right away or write great paragraphs right away, but people do need some guidance on what a great sentence looks like or what the varieties of great sentences look like, so they can kind of imitate them and then develop their own style on top of it. Let me give you a quick example. Joan Didion, when she was a young, aspiring writer, used to literally take out a book by Hemingway and copy what he wrote. And what she was trying to do, and lots of people have done that over the years. Benjamin Franklin did it with Addison Steele, the English essayists of the 18th century. But what Benjamin Franklin was doing and what Joan Didion was doing was trying to understand deep in their bones what the basic structure of a good sentence or a good paragraph or a good essay or a good story or a good scene, to understand what those are and what they feel like. And on top of that, they were over time able to develop their own distinctive style. So I do think that there are some really incredibly useful ways that you can kind of create a foundation. And then there's also some interesting tricks, and we can talk about them later on, for what you can do to develop your own style. I do not think that a writing manual necessarily means a paint-by-numbers thing. But I do think it needs to establish a framework and then show people how they can adapt that framework to their own needs and to their own personality and their own goals and so forth.
Well, Charlie, before I let Alex comment on that, let me just say, I know, for example, I've often told young poets the best way to understand something is to do that, copy something, and then take a famous poem by Emily Dickinson, say, and start substituting words that sound alike, and see how much it can cohere. For example, the best way to undermine a cliche often, a broken heart, you might say, a token heart or something, because people will hear the oak and they will hear the broken when you have the word token there. But I think one of the things that I remember from the book, and I read it after Alex and a few other people on my website's e-list had recommended me reading it, was that he didn't seem to understand that there were many ways to get a great sentence. For example, you can have a seemingly banal sentence like "Bill was aghast," but if that little pithy sentence is standalone at the end of a great paragraph that's antithetical to someone being aghast, that because Bill was aghast can be like a double exclamation point that is a great sentence, even though it's not technically great.
Absolutely. Everything depends on context. But what I often tell my students when I'm working with them is something that that Ernest Hemingway once said when he was asked about how he deals with writer's block. And you're probably familiar with this passage, which comes from his posthumous book. But he said, well, what I do is I stand up, I grab an orange, I start to peel it, I drop the rinds into the fire, I let them fizzle up, and I start to think to myself, and I say, okay, you've written a great sentence before, you can do it again. And so I sit down, I struggle, I write one great sentence, and if I can write one great sentence, I can write a second, and then if I can write a second, I can write a third, and so forth. So I think, although there are many forms of great sentences, from that very simple one that you just offered to complex and compound sentences, sentences that branch right and sentences that branch left. Although there are many kinds of great sentences, there are kind of basic cores that if we really understand them and if we understand the variations, then we really can teach somebody how to write a great sentence. And once we do that, we can start to bunch them up and we can start to talk about, well, what makes a great paragraph? And then we can build on those two building blocks. And then we can start to think about, okay, how can we stylize this sentence, or how can we locate this sentence so it has the maximum impact, or the point-counterpoint, as you were just discussing, or create a sense of mystery, or whatever it is you're aiming for in that sentence or that paragraph or that larger passage.
Alex, what's your response to Charlie's points?
So before I respond to the points themselves, I'd just like to say that we need to have similar working definitions. We need to know what we're talking about. When Dan and I use the word great, for example, like a great paragraph or a great sentence or a great book, it's not exactly something that's just merely competent. For example, can you theoretically have some sort of style guide that teaches somebody to write something like Moby Dick? My answer to that is most likely no. You cannot. Moby Dick is an example of truly great writing. It's not something that you could necessarily teach anyone, even on a sentence-by-sentence basis. That would be extremely difficult, if not outright impossible. You could have a book that's titled something like, How to Write Great Business Emails. Now, I would take issue with the title, perhaps, because we're not really talking about great emails. What is that even as a concept? We're talking about competent emails, how to write competent emails that don't confuse the shit out of your employees, that don't, mess with communication, that don't force somebody to do something that's the exact opposite that you want them to do because you don't know how to string together, grammatical sense. So, to me, when it comes to style guides in general, like you said, the goal needs to be a bit reduced. It's not to create great fiction or anything like that. It's to take people that can't write in general into the realm of being able to be somehow competent. This is more or less what happens ideally in schools. This is what could happen with adults that are, either functionally illiterate or semi-literate or whatever, and you need to sort of get them up to speed, but you can't quite turn something like that into greatness. That is a completely different quantity. It's a completely different quality. Has very little to do with just ordinary communication or ordinary kind of self-expression that's meant for everyday functions.
Yeah, I guess I would say I agree in part and I disagree in part. I disagree that you can't create a system for creating greatness. I mean, greatness by the very definition is something that stands apart from the merely good or the competent or the effective. So greatness is something that kind of goes beyond the realm of good, solid, engaging, even dramatic writing. So of course not. If you could come up with a guide to show somebody how to write another Moby Dick or another Farewell to Arms or another Great Gatsby, then it's kind of foolhardy because it kind of violates the basic essential quality of greatness, which is something that stands out, something that does not fit molds. However, I would say that a manual or a coaching process or a seminar can teach you how to go from competent to very good, and can give people the tools where if they have that spark of greatness, they can get there a little better or a little faster. And so I do think that there's a lot of room here to go from, very solid, very accomplished, very clear to something, much, much better. So I do not think, I would argue very, very strongly against the idea that we should think of writing manuals or writing instruction for that matter, as tools for just the kind of lowest, the lowest quality of writing.
Well, Charlie, let me just pick up on that, because when you say writing and writing well, when I look at manuals, I see writing well for a business letter. I don't see writing well for creative writing, and there's a vast difference, because creative writing, I've often said to a lot of young writers that good writers need to learn grammar and all the rules of good writing. Great writers need to forget them, and that's one of the differences that you don't see. I was just looking up, because a few months ago I read a book called Reading Like a Writer by Francine Prose, and I remember reading through that book, and we'll get to Pinker's book in a moment. I just want to give background to the idea of manuals. When I was reading Prose's book, I was thinking, my God, she lives up to her name. I mean, her ideas are so prosaic. She would present, for example, all of her idea, for example, of good sentences were long sentences, Proustian wannabe sentences, even if those sentences were larded with a half a dozen cliches within them. She would still think, well, because this took me from this cliche to that cliche to that cliche and back, that's a good sentence. And to me, this is so antithetical to what writing is, because, as I said, individuation, the ability to put your own imprint on your art, just as you can't mistake a Michelangelo for a Caravaggio painting. That's the thing that is missing in all manuals that I've ever read, whether it's Drunk and White, whether it's Pinker, whether it's Francine Prose, whether it's the Chicago Manual of Style. I guess I'm getting back to my initial point. Do you think that we're talking good writing in terms of just clear, as Pinker seems to think all good writing, clear, lucid writing, or writing that somehow goes underneath? Because Pinker's whole book, from what I recall reading it was about a year and a half ago that I read it fully, seems to think that all lucid writing is good writing, even if that lucidity and easy to graspness is filled with cliches.
Well, let me kind of go at that with a metaphor. Okay, suppose you're teaching a kid how to throw a curveball in baseball, and suppose the kid doesn't really know how to throw a ball in the first place. The kid is either new to the game, or was mistaught earlier, or he has a leg injury or an arm injury which is causing him to overcompensate or something like that. Before you can teach somebody to do something specialized, like throw a curveball, you need to make sure that they're using basic motions in a way that's going to enable them to do that specialized activity. So, for example, I once took some kids to a baseball game, and lo and behold, at the baseball game, we meet Jim Bouton, the pitcher and the author of Ball 4.
Yeah.
And we spent about 2 hours with Jim Bouton. We watched the game, and we talked baseball, and I asked him, okay, what tips would you give these kids for how to throw a ball and how to avoid arm injury and how to throw specialized pitches like curveballs and screwballs and so forth? And he said, well, it's very easy. Very few people do it these days, but you long toss. And by long tossing, he means you throw the ball longer than the 60-foot 6-inch distance between the mound and the plate. You throw it 100 feet away. You throw it 120 feet away. You throw it 160 feet away. And the reason you do that is to find your natural motion. You're not going to find a natural motion if you're kind of tangled up in thinking about locating the ball at a certain part of the plate, or if you're thinking about putting a particular spin on it. But only when you find your natural motion by doing something very, very basic, only when you get the basic thing down, and you get it down again and again and again, can you think about style. But when you do achieve that, when you do get the basic motion, whether you're throwing a baseball or writing a sentence or writing a paragraph, there are some very specific, simple, usable tools you can do to add a sense of style to that, to use Pinker's title. So, I guess my basic point is that too many people, even accomplished writers, make some basic mistakes when they're constructing sentences, paragraphs, sections, and so forth. And those mistakes can be pointed out. Some of them are quite common. And then once you've kind of ironed yourself out, once you've done the writing equivalent of long tossing, then you can move in closer and you can add some stylistics to it. But you really can't do that. You can't even begin to talk about style until you get the basics. And there are a number of, even well-published authors who don't have those basics down really. And they could benefit from, a workout.
Alex, I want your comment, and then we'll move on to Pinker's book specifically.
I think, Charlie, your sports example is telling for a couple of reasons. First of all, I agree that there's definitely things that one can do incrementally to create, a real difference from, somebody that can't ride at all to get them a little better. At the same time, continuing the sports metaphor, yes, you could teach somebody how to throw a curveball. Yes, you could teach somebody to dribble better, to shoot baskets better. But at the same time, you have to think about what is the actual ceiling. So I could spend, let's say my whole day, every single day, practicing basketball. I could have done it since I was 6 years old. I could have been a foot taller than I am. But even with extreme practice, even with extreme dedication, even with sort of everything being on my side, at least outside, there's still no guarantee that I would be a great college player in basketball, much less somebody like Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant. There is a clear definitional ceiling, something that I cannot see, something that I cannot quite understand, but the ability would simply not be there. I cannot practice all day in the hopes of becoming great in whatever if I don't have that spark. I think that's really the core of my argument with style manuals that purport to do more than bring somebody up to a basic kind of level of competence. Because even if you have a couple tricks up your sleeve and make the writing flow a little better, make something interesting here or there, that's still not the same thing as working on an extremely high level that would make something very memorable, that would make you kind of in some sort of pantheon of good writers. That's a completely different thing. And again, continuing the sports metaphor, I could spend all day practicing in whatever sport, but I will never be a great athlete. That's simply a limit that has always been there, based on biology, based on a million things that I can't even think of, that nobody can think of. And the same thing probably even more so applies to something like writing. Perhaps there was an experience that somebody had early on that sort of got them into a poetic mindset. Perhaps there was something else. Perhaps their DNA was structured in such a way where they're able to see a little better when it comes to musicality and rhythm in a sense, or whatever it might be. We simply do not know. And I think trying to apply rules to do more than your competence, it's kind of a fool's game. And I have never seen an example of this being done really well.
Well, let me.
Well,
go ahead.
Can I just say something?
Yeah,
real quick?
go ahead.
I have never made the claim, and I tried to clarify that before, that you can use some tricks from a manual to become great. What I tried to say is that you can go from good to a lot better, whatever that level of good might be. Because there's a number. Here's how I look at it. I used to teach in the writing program at Yale, and the writing program I was teaching at was created by William Zinsser, the author of On Writing Well. And what Zinsser did, his approach, and it's carried on to this day, his approach is the class is called Reading and Writing the Essay. And the approach is to read great pieces of writing, however you're going to define great, and I could define it for you later if you want, but to read great writers and to break them up, to reverse engineer them, and to say, okay, what did Hemingway do in this passion? What did Didion do in this passion? What did Pinker do in this passion? I think he's a terrific writer, by the way, even though this book is deeply disappointing. What maneuvers, what tricks, what moves did this author make in this paragraph, in this section, in this sentence, in this end of a sentence? And by immersing yourself in the great people, you can become better than you are, whether you start off at the level of mediocrity or whether you start off at a level of pretty good. And so I am not making the argument that there's any formula for greatness, because as I said before, greatness by definition is standing out from everything else. But I do think that it would be a fool's errand, to use your word, to kind of give up on giving help to anybody except the mediocre or the less competent.
Well, let's end this segment. In the next segment, I want to focus specifically on Pinker's book and have both of you just briefly detail your gripes against the book's claims, and then we'll talk about each of them, and we'll do that in a moment. Charlie Euchner and Al Sheremet are here talking about Steven Pinker's The Sense of Style, a book released a few years ago, another in a seemingly endless line of writing manuals in American history. Charlie's essay, which I'll link to below here, was called The Mighty Pinker Has Struck Out, and in it you talk about the three major ideas that Pinker has, and you call it a fatal mistake. So talk about the three major ideas that Pinker has in his book about good writing, why you think they're a mistake, and any other point that you may have regarding why you think the book does not succeed.
Honestly, I'm not sure what you're referring to, so refresh my memory.
It says here, how does Pinker fail so badly? And then it says, let's zoom in on Pinker's fatal mistake. It's useful to begin, Pinker says, by examining the hidden structure of writing, the web, the tree, the string.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, so he says that there's basically three structures of writing, whether you're talking about a sentence or an essay or whatever. And the web is what it sounds like, which is a kind of concatenation of ideas held together without any kind of linear structure. A tree is something with a basic trunk that kind of branches off into different directions. And a string is a series of particular moments or ideas. It could be a story, like first this happened, then that happened, then that happened, then that happened. Or it could be an idea. You know, let's define this topic. Okay, now let's define that topic, and so forth. So he says that there's these three basic structures. And honestly, I can't really disagree with that, but I don't really see how they're terrifically helpful. What he seems to do in this book is use them as a way to kind of show his ability to dazzle the reader, rather than showing how to write, you know, terrific sentences or paragraphs. Let me give you one example. He uses this sentence, and he says, "How do we fix this sentence?" His approach to fixing it, by the way, is to use the web. He says, "The bridge to the aisles are crowded." Okay, so he says, "How do we fix this sentence? How do we go about doing that? Because it's clearly wrong. It should be the bridge to the islands is crowded, right?" But a lot of people, especially, you know, beginning writers, but there's some more advanced writers that make this kind of mistake too. A lot of people make that mistake because the plural word, islands, is closest to the verb, which is crowded, or are crowded, right? And so what's Pinker's answer to this question? Pinker's answer is to create this awful, I mean truly awful. We could include a picture of it in your blog that goes with video, kind of diagram of the sentence that has 22 different components with all kinds of lines and curves and circles and words and labels and so forth, which he claims somehow makes it easy to figure out whether you should say the bridge to the islands is crowded or the bridge to the islands are crowded. Now, I was always taught, and I'll give credit to my 10th grade English teacher, Mr. Leonard, I was always taught that the best way to deal with this issue is to isolate the subject and the verb, and to put in brackets anything that's kind of extraneous or extra. So in this case, the subject is clearly the bridge, because that's what we're talking about. The extraneous stuff is to the islands. That's a prepositional phrase, and prepositional phrases, it's what they do is to modify something in, under, to, after, before, and so forth. And then crowded or is crowded is the verb. So solving this problem is actually super, super easy. anybody can do it as long as they're given a basic distinction, subject and verb, and then modifier to the subject. And Pinker manages to turn it into this big bloody mess. When you look at the image in the book, it looks like somebody just threw a bunch of spaghetti against the wall, and some of the spaghetti's sticking, and some of the tomato sauce is sticking, and the sausage and whatever else is in the spaghetti. And it doesn't do a thing to clarify your thinking on it. And in fact, it makes it much more confusing, and it makes you actually feel a little stupid because you're being given this kind of shortcut, this nifty tool to sort things out, and it's actually so complicated it makes you want to give up. Let me say one quick thing about this. Lots of people, of course, talk fondly of the good old days when students were required to diagram sentences. And Stephen King, who used to teach English before he started having success with his fiction, Stephen King used to teach diagramming sentences too. But he always did it not as a kind of hard and fast rule or as a discipline, but he did it as a kind of game, a way to play with words, to see how words are associated with it, and to understand and discover the joy of playing. He didn't do it as a problem-solving thing. He did it as a way of exploring language and its many pieces and the many ways that it can fit together. And so if you want to use that kind of spaghetti against the wall approach Pinker offers as a form of play, then I say terrific. That could be kind of fun to pick apart and put back together again. But as a piece of advice, as a method for figuring out what's wrong with something, or to figure out if something is right, or something can be even more right, even something can be better, it's a total waste. And Pinker, I'll say one last thing. Pinker is a rock star. He's great looking, he's dazzling, and he's charismatic. And his earlier books on violence, evolution, and so forth are really wonderful, and I really want to give him credit. This is not an anti-Pinker thing. They're really wonderful because they offer really deep discussions of topics in a really clear and lucid way, certainly more than you get in an academic journal article, and with a little bit of humor, a little bit of panache. And so that's who he is. He's an academic rock star. The problem is that rather than kind of breaking things down into tools that we can use to improve our writing, at whatever level we are. Rather than doing that, he wants to kind of show off and dazzle. And to me, that is the primary problem with this whole book, is that it's really more the Steven Pinker show. Steven Pinker appears on stage and dazzles the crowd than it is a useful point-by-point set of insider's tools to taking your writing up to another level.
Before I let Alex on, let me just say, do you think that that's symptomatic of the internet? And I say this because, to me, one of the biggest problems online is what I call scialism, which is people thinking that because they can Google information handily, that they actually understand what they're Googling. And Pinker certainly comes from the same school as most people who study the brain, the Chomskys and whatnot. And it seems that, to me, when I read the book, it was just a lot of over-analytical stuff that the book could probably have been more effective at 1/4 its length, and that he, as a brain analyst, a study of the brain, is overthinking things. Is that what you think?
Well, yes and no. Let me just respond by pointing to a critique that Pinker himself makes of others. He says that the reason we have a hard time mastering something like writing, which is a fairly complex process when you think about it, from a brain perspective. The problem that most people have is what he calls the curse of knowledge. And I think he's absolutely right. The problem with it is that we don't know all that we know. And we don't know what we don't know, or at least we don't think about it very often. And so we kind of build on what we know without helping other people to kind of get to that same foundation first. And that's what Pinker does in this book. He kind of assumes something about the readers. I'm not even quite sure what he's assuming. But he's assuming that they already know things about sentences and certain things about paragraphs, which would have been useful to at least kind of review in 3 or 4 paragraphs apiece. It wouldn't have taken more than a couple pages. But rather than kind of establishing a baseline, he starts right in on debates about style and especially debates about usage. He spends 117 pages just giving critiques of other people's critiques of certain kinds of word usages. And those are interesting discussions, and I found some of his comments right and some of his comments wrong. These are all debatable, of course. But rather than kind of getting everybody oriented, which I think is the number one job of all writing, rather than getting everybody oriented first and then building on that kind of baseline, he just jumps right in with his dazzling comments about this word and that word and his overcomplicated explanations of how you fix the simple, let's see, 2, 4, 7 word sentence. The bridge to the islands is crowded. Rather than getting us all oriented, all on the same page, he just jumps in with his dazzling wordplay of his own, and I think that's a fatal mistake.
Alex, what are your comments about Charles's critique of Pinker being overly prolix and arcane to a certain degree, and what then are your comments or major thrust of your essay?
I generally agree that the book is a style guide. It's not exactly something that's very useful. Most of it is just a series of abstractions. That said, I do think it's interesting as far as most style guides, they begin with certain kind of viewpoints that they try to deduce, not necessarily through examples, but just things that let me put it this way: with Pinker's book, he forces or tries to force the reader to sort of intuit his own rules. Right? He doesn't begin necessarily with a list of proscriptions or a list of things that ought to be done. He begins basically with passages that, from that point on, they need to be sort of internalized. They need to be interpreted from kind of inside out. And I think in the long run, when it comes to writing books on style, I think maybe a few decades from now or whatever, there is going to be a truly good style guide that pretty much gets everything right. And when that happens, it will very much take the tack of, a lot of these rules, they need to sort of be intuitive, they need to be understood on a fundamental, visceral level, as opposed to simply be written out. And that's partly because when you do start writing out these rules, you are necessarily, therefore, kind of cutting everything else aside. You mentioned, Dan, earlier that this book might be in some ways good for academic style writing, but when it comes to fiction, so many things simply will never ever apply. So many things, in fact, will end up doing the exact opposite of the intended effects. So I think that's a kind of a very mild praise of the book, but overwhelmingly my critique would be negative, as I said earlier. And in one sense, I would say the basic problem in Pinker's book is the fact that he confuses communication and clarity in general with art, and the two are not necessarily one and the same. Art is a form of very high communication, but it's not just any kind of communication. When he goes from having these sort of implicit rules to the actual examples themselves, like I said, he has the 4 modern passages. These are the things that either while in cliches or they're very kind of functional passages that he thinks are much higher than they are. Whether it's a review of a children's writer, I forget who, that's just a very kind of clunky, over-the-top piece of writing that, for whatever reason, he thinks is good, or whether he sort of critiques his wife's work. A lot of this stuff that he finds kind of surprising or like interesting turns of phrase, I find very predictable. Part of this is because, unlike Pinker, my expertise is actually in the arts. So I am here to actually look at the patterns in writing. I'm here to see, whether or not I can guess where a certain, passage or the narrative as a whole is going. And things that he finds to be kind of very interesting, kind of sleight of hands, I find the exact opposite. Perhaps this is an issue of experience or inexperience, but I get the feeling that even with people with a whole kind of a great deal of exposure, it's not necessarily a guarantee that they would understand exactly what they're looking at, what they're reading. in the long run, I think the best style guide will be something that will kind of, in effect, function as a work of art in and of itself. So, for example, imagine a style guide that is somehow kind of embedded within a novel. A story unfolds and it's told exceptionally well, and as the story unfolds, the narrator, or the author, or whatever you're going to say, ends up sort of critiquing the story as it happens, pointing out what works and what doesn't work, why a certain decision was made, why a certain decision was passed over. This is the sort of thing, provided it's done well, that could really get somebody that perhaps has a spark of greatness within him, has a talent to be more than merely competent. They could actually use something like this for their own ends, because they could finally see. So this is what I've been missing. This is exactly what I needed to do, but I wasn't able to quite see. So in the long run, I feel like Pinker's kind of emphasis on intuiting these rules is right, but he doesn't do it enough. And with the examples themselves, when they do in fact come, and they have to eventually come, they have to be well chosen. In his case, they were terribly chosen. That completely destroys his own argument.
Well, let me just.
Yeah. I want to say real quick.
Okay, go ahead.
I meant to agree with Alex before about the way that Pinker sets up those four models. He puts out fairly long passages from four different authors, including his wife, and he says, "These are amazing, and let us now see why these passages are so amazing." And when I read them, my reaction was, "Ugh, these are awful." So I kind of wonder why a guy like that doesn't find somebody that is, truly great. There are so many great passages from literature that you could use to kind of break down writing and analyze it, look at inside out. You don't necessarily have to draw hard and fast rules from it, but you can point out wonderful little maneuvers that the author takes.
Well, Charlie,
yeah.
I think that the answer to that is obvious. Pinker is trying to make the claim, this politically correct claim, that everyone is creative, that everyone has it within them somehow, and that if you follow these rules, you may not end up a Dickens, you may not end up Elizabeth Barrett Browning, you may not end up John Donne, but you can be good. And that in and of itself is fallacious. And so by using his rock star status to elevate his wife's work or some work, other rather even mediocre passages, he's trying to put an imprimatur on things to say, oh, see, you can do this. I had an argument a couple of months ago when I was interviewing people on postmodernism, where a woman critic I was speaking to asked me, well, why do you care about quality in criticism? Which was an amazing comment, because what the hell is criticism about except to get to what's good and bad in whether it's society, whether it's the arts, whether it's the sciences. So I think Pinker, well, let me just add, do both of you agree that Pinker has an implicit, I guess we'd call it mission in the book, that he wants to say that good writing can be demotic?
I guess so. I don't really know. I thought his mission was to help writers write better. And I think the way you do that is you show excellence. I mean, you can only learn excellence by observing it and breaking it down and understanding and trying it out and seeing what works and seeing what doesn't. And so by using four mediocrities to teach excellence, he's, as Alex says, he's gone off the rails from the get-go.
Well, I'll just add that, I will give him credit for the fact that he explicitly avoids any sort of, kind of foray into fiction. He is not trying to teach people how to write fiction well. He does mention that he's emphasizing what he calls classic prose, which is more geared towards, nonfiction, academic kind of writing, perhaps journalism. I think he kind of implicitly understands that he can't quite teach people how to write fiction, because a lot of these rules kind of go out the window. At the same time, with the rules that do in fact remain, that can be salvageable or usable in some way, he simply doesn't do a good job of explaining how they in fact apply. The very nature of a style guide is, unless you come from the beginning and say, most of you reading this book would try to improve your writing, you won't really have much success unless you do that from the get-go. I think the assumption in any kind of style guide is the idea that it is demotic, that writing in general can be improved. And in fact, in a purely technical sense, I mean, this is true. If we go essentially from a pre-literate society to a society that is literate, you could argue that, somebody that could write, halfway decently probably is able to better organize his or her thoughts compared to somebody that is completely illiterate and, has no kind of experience with this sort of thing, maybe. At the same time, there is an implicit ceiling that he doesn't necessarily discuss, that, it's there, but it's not a popular topic to bring up, partly because, again, like you mentioned, with political correctness, there is an assumption that most ceilings can in some ways be breached. This may not be the case, but that is the thought. And I think it is implicit in any kind of style guide, unless it's explicitly mentioned to be the exact opposite.
I don't think that either Charlie or Alex has the quote in either of their essays, but to me, the passage that stood out the most, that a year and a half or so later still is the pea under my bed mattress, is he gives a quote of someone, and I forget who, talking about all the sands of Arabia, and he uses a very familiar quote. What?
Yeah, that's Dawkins. That's the first example.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so yeah, and he gives a quote. And do you have it on your essay?
Yeah, I critique each of the 4 passages at length.
Okay, yeah, but I don't think you have that particular thing. But anyway, Dawkins uses this cliche, and then he slightly modifies it with one little modifier, and Pinker raves about this as somehow subverting the cliche. When it clearly doesn't subvert the cliche, it actually puts an underline under the cliche. It reminds me of when I did a show on Western films, and there's the famous passage in The Searchers with John Wayne, where John Wayne looks at the Indians, and he's a racist, and John Ford has to zoom in close because he didn't feel that John Wayne was a good enough actor to convey this. And that little use of a modifier by Dawkins only emphasizes the cliche. It says, here. See, I'm trying to show that this isn't a cliche. When you undermine a cliche, for example, if you said broken heart and you use it in a sentence, during the Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer had his heart broken by an arrow. Well, that's clearly, not a cliche because it's physical and it's the actual thing that might have happened. I don't know whether he was actually shot in the heart, but and so there you get Pinker raving for several paragraphs about a thing that actually makes the passage in the cliche worse. And to me, that shows that Pinker, and I think he's a very good science writer. I wouldn't put him on a par with Stephen Jay Gould or Lauren Isley, but that shows the utter lack of understanding creative writing versus what he seems to emphasize, lucid writing. Either of you want to comment on that use, that kind of, I guess, rhetorical usage by Pinker to make points?
So specifically, the example that he used was Dawkins, I think, Unweaving the Rainbow, and the example that he cites would have been a cliche is all the sands of Arabia. To him, this is a cliche. What Dawkins, in fact, writes is all the sand grains of Arabia.
Yeah, okay.
He thinks of the addition of this minor word because it's so slightly different that it somehow completely decontextualizes the whole passage. This obviously is not true, much as the fact that throughout the entire passage as it is, he kind of weaves in and out of insights that appear to be kind of rich or deep. But when you actually think about what he's saying, they're very, very superficial observations. And the fact that these superficial observations are couched in language that is kind of, wannabe poeticisms, it does, like you said, it underlines the flaws. It basically becomes a kind of a child's conception of what good writing looks like. This is somebody that, let's say, has never been exposed to great writing, and they think, if I change this around slightly, this whole thing will alter. It's kind of like on the E-list when you have people sending poetry around, and you tell them, this poem does not work for this that reason. Instead of sort of sitting with it for a week and maybe rewriting the whole thing, they try to alter a word or a comma or something very, very minor, and and they think that this kind of inversion is enough, but the substance is still the same. The whole thing needs to change. And that specific example, that's obviously not an inversion of cliche. The definition of inversion is you contextualize, you strip it of any kind of ordinary, immediately, apprehendable meaning. You make it very unfamiliar in some way. You sort of call in the cliche, but then you completely, eliminate that from the reader's mind. But that's clearly it's not being done in that passage.
Charlie?
Yeah, I think it's very simple. I think Steven Pinker. I'll just go back to what I said before. Steven Pinker is a rock star, and he's used to performing, and he's used to being on a stage, and he's used to having total command of whatever it is that he's writing about. And most of his career, he's been writing about evolution and the brain. And so he has a kind of mastery of that, which enables him to be dazzling because he's got the basics down. And so he can find the perfect metaphor. He can find the perfect angle to talk to you about different regions of the brain, for example, and make them come to life. And that's why I have admired Pinker, because he had total mastery of the subject. And the sense that I get from this book is that somebody, probably an editor, somebody said, "Boy, Stephen, you're such an amazing explainer of complex ideas. Maybe you can explain how you explain." And the fact of the matter is that he doesn't know how to do that. He knows how to do his own thing well, but he doesn't know how to show other people how to do it. And you would think that an expert on the brain who understands about cognition and metacognition and so forth, you would think that someone like him would have said, "Hold it. Just because I can throw the baseball well doesn't mean I can teach somebody to throw the baseball well, because I've never done it before." And so to me, that's the big problem, is he basically got in too deep. He didn't have his 10,000 hours of practice on breaking writing apart and putting it back together again and explaining how to do so. And he jumped in without, the deep knowledge that he brought to previous subjects. By the way, that's a criticism that has also been leveled against his previous book on violence. People say, look, you waded into this topic without really doing your homework, and you can't just read a pile of books and be an expert. It requires much deeper engagement. And so I think, Pinker is just suffering from being so awesome in one field that he thinks he can be awesome in another field.
I think the book itself, my own opinion is that it's good when it comes to things like, the difference between run-on and complex sentences, which amazingly I get hundreds of emails a week where people will say that I have a run-on sentence when it's merely a complex sentence. They don't understand what that is. He's good when he debunks things like, the pejorative claim about split infinitives and things like that. I think when it comes to talking about things like enjambment, say in poetry, or the appearance of cliches, or the stuff that gets beyond mere grammar, he's well out of his element. But I want to go to a point that I think most people conflate with art in general and writing specifically. And Alex, you claim that Pinker does it too. You say at one point in your essay, yes, there's an unfortunate conflation of good writing with the truth, in quotes, that Pinker eventually makes, but in this comment, at least, are the seeds of what art is, a mere trick. Do you think that Pinker, and this is to Alex and then Charlie can comment, do you think that Pinker buys into the idea that art is somehow truth, when even if you just look at the Latin roots of the word art, it not only is not truth, it cannot be truth, because art is not reality, and there's the conflation of truth with reality?
I think if it comes down to it, if he's asked, to explain his position, he might, simply because the common thread around him is yes, art is truth. Yes, art is a representation of facts and these kinds of realities. At the same time, implicitly, he might not think that at all. There's a very big difference between what people say they believe when they're oppressed versus how they behave for the remainder of their lives. People could be absolute nihilists when they're asked about meaning in the world, and yet for 99.9% of the rest of day-to-day existence, they behave as if everything's absolutely rational and everything kind of falls into place. So I'm not sure what he actually believes, but I get the feeling that given how close he veers to the typical explanations of art and good writing and so on and so forth in his own style guide, he would probably take the popular tack. It's not something that he's an expert in. It's not something he probably even thought about all that much. So it is what it is.
Charlie, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, honestly, I don't think that Pinker really engages that. But I'll just say one quick thing, because I think it gets at the question of how much can you learn, how much can you be coached, how much can you kind of build your own knowledge and your own capacity. I don't think that, if the question is art truth, then I guess I'd have to say no. But what I do say is that it can somehow touch on a truth. So if you listen to, Miles Davis' Sketches of Spain, or if you look at the last scene in Woody Allen's Manhattan, or if you look at the passages of the characters in the famous final scene of A Farewell to Arms, if you look at certain passages of In Cold Blood, which is, I think, an absolutely brilliant piece of nonfiction narrative, there are moments where they touch on a truth. And that's a really wonderful thing. And I don't think that you should really demand much more of art or much more of writing than occasionally getting to a point where you touch on a truth. When you try to systematize it and say, well, this thing captured all of truth, that's when you get, really arrogant, and that's when you get further and further away from truth. But those are just some random thoughts. I don't think Pinker really gives that a whole lot of thought or a whole lot of consideration.
Well, just to comment on that, Dan often he makes a distinction between truth and reality. It's something I agree with. Basically, truth is it's a factual thing. It's a thing that happened. So like the truth would say of the Civil War or of slavery would be stuff that you might find in a good nonfiction text. Whereas reality is the thing underpinning those facts. So, for example, Huckleberry Finn. It's not the truth as far as there was not a boy named Huckleberry Finn. The events related were not things that actually occurred in the way described. And despite the fact that it's a work of fiction, something that never happened, it gets at not the truth, but the underpinning reality of slavery and race relations and how children think about the world in a way that probably 1,000 books on that era would not give you a better slice of reality than this book that is fiction, and yet it still gets a reality in a far more deeper, meaningful way. I think art does that exceptionally well. This is partly why art even exists. When I was younger, for example, I tried to better understand myself and either relationships I had with girls as a teenager or whatever it was, not by reading books in psychology, but by looking at great films like Woody Allen's films that actually tackle those subjects in a deep and meaningful way. You see how people behave. You know how to apply it to your own life, and this is despite the fact that they're creations, and yet because they are creations that clearly come from the underpinning reality, it doesn't matter they're not real. They become real in a very meaningful sense, despite being utter fictions in the sense of truth and not truth.
Well, I want to know the final segment. I'll give you both closing remarks. I have one final thing to ask here in this segment, but I just want to comment. The best way I could elucidate the difference between reality and truth is that right now, as we are recording this, the reality is that Dan is interviewing Charlie and Alex about Steven Pinker's book. But the statement, Dan is interviewing Charlie and Alex about Steven Pinker's book, is either true or false. So truth or falseness is always a commentary upon the bedrock reality. As far as my final point that I want to ask in this segment, it seems to me that both of you and your criticisms of Pinker's book are slightly different, and I want to paraphrase both of them and have you comment on it. Charlie seems to be saying that he thinks that Pinker is generally correct in his pronouncements, but he fails in the explication of those pronouncements. Alex seems to be a bit more negative on Pinker's actual claims, and as well as the explication. Charlie, do you think that's a fair assessment of your opinion of Pinker?
Well, not totally. I mean, I think that he does some things well, like his 117 pages on usage although all of the points that he makes are debatable, I agree with most of them. Should we accept this word like contact as a verb, or should we not? He has some good thoughts on that. He's a smart guy, and he has reasons for deciding to frown on this word or smile on that word. But I think he's deeply flawed in his overall approach to writing. Let me give you one very specific example. At one point, he started, after a very, very brief discussion of sentences, I think, he starts saying, okay, what about the paragraph? Actually, you know what? There's no such thing as a paragraph. He actually says this. He says that it's kind of nonsensical to think of a paragraph as anything but a kind of break in the action, a place to hit the return key and create a little bit of white space and give the reader a breather. And I think that's about as wrong as he could possibly be. Certainly, a paragraph break does that. It gives you a break. It gives you a moment where you can kind of catch your breath and say, okay, I'm going to shift my attention. But a paragraph is actually a lot more than that. We could come up with different definitions of paragraphs, but to just wave it off as kind of inconsequential, except for to give people a breather, is amazingly wrong-headed. I would define, I think there is a definition, or at least a working definition, a debatable definition. You might or might not agree with it, but at least gets us thinking about it in a useful way. My definition of a paragraph is the expression and development of a single idea. And I argue that most paragraphs go wrong and they confuse both the writer and the reader, because writing is such a creative process that one thought triggers another and another and another. And so too often a whole jumble of thoughts get put together in a paragraph that don't really have anything to do with each other, and you never develop the idea that you originally set out to develop. And so I argue that we should think about paragraphs as just single, developed ideas, and think of writing as kind of like a string. I talk about the paragraph bucket, where every paragraph is a bucket, and into that bucket should just be one idea and things that support that one idea. And when you start to put other ideas in the paragraph bucket, you're going to go wrong. And so I argue that basically every piece of writing is kind of a string of these buckets. And when I kind of discovered this, just working with my students and working with my own writing and where I went off on tangents and so forth, I started to look at some of the great writers, and I'll mention Truman Capote is one who I think is his book In Cold Blood is a true piece of literature, or Ernest Hemingway. When you look at these people and you look at their paragraphs, you see that, by God, you do that too. They just state and develop one idea at a time. And I don't know how consciously they do it, but they do it. And it's a common pattern that you see in good writers and in great writers as well. That's not to say it's done 100% of the time, but it is a very common pattern. And when we have that understanding, it gives us a very useful way to kind of check our own paragraphing. And so for Pinker to just wave away one of the most important elements of writing, I think the two most important elements of writing are the sentence and the paragraph. For him to just wave away and say, oh, it's nothing really, it just gives you a chance to catch your breath, I think is kind of amazingly ignorant and amazingly unreflective and amazingly kind of uncaring for truly great writing, whether it's Hemingway or Melville or someone else, Joan Didion, whoever.
Alex, would you agree with my assessment of your critique of Pinker?
I'd say in general the book is it's a very mixed bag. I agree in general with the premise that anything that is sort of given as a how-to when it comes to writing needs to be intuited rather than explicitly stated. At the same time, as the book progresses, you need examples. You do need concrete proofs of what you're saying. Pinker does that very badly. That execution is poor and starts to inevitably doubt even some of the good ideas that he kind of starts at the beginning, or he sort of has somewhat later in the book as well. If you really sort of take the book objectively for what it is, in general, you're just left very confused with exactly what he wants to do. and it's not something that he could recover from, given that the critical flaws just pile on so early in the book. Literally, I think in like the second chapter.
Well, we'll take a break here in the final segment. I'll give you both a chance to wrap up your final thoughts, and we'll do that in a moment. Speaking with Charlie Euchner and Alex Sheremet about Steven Pinker's The Sense of Style, The Thinking Person's Guide to Writing in the 21st Century. I will link to both of the essays that are quoted within, as well as Alex's and Charlie's websites below this video. Before I give you just a summary, your last comment, Charlie, got me thinking that one of these days I've got to do a show on the nonsense of stream of consciousness writing, because I think when I read, whether it's the terrible prose, I think, of Virginia Woolf, or the hit and miss prose of James Joyce or their literary descendants, I always think stream of consciousness is the biggest bullshit about writing, because every human being I've ever known thinks punctually. When we go even when we're silent and our eyebrows go up, that is punctuation in the human thought. So the whole idea of stream of consciousness, that's another thing that's a burr under my saddle. But your comment got me thinking about that. So Charlie, let me just give you a minute or two to wrap up any final thoughts that you may have omitted or elided thus far about Pinker or the book.
Yeah, well, I think that my takeaway here is, if you want to read this book and if you want to have some contact with a truly intelligent thinker, I think Pinker is an intelligent thinker, and I appreciate him, although I think this is a bad book. But if you want to have some contact with that in this book, read the 117 pages on usage and pretty much throw away the rest. Because he's a thoughtful guy. He's on a dictionary board which makes decisions on usage. So this is something that he actually does think about. But he clearly hasn't thought through the other elements of writing, whether it's sentences or paragraphs or story structure or argument structure. He might be good, and I think he's very good, at explaining complex, abstract scientific ideas, particularly where he has real expertise, like evolution in the brain. But when he gets out of his depth, he's not very useful at all. So I say, just go to those pages where he talks about usage. It's about 117 pages of them. Get the book from the library, don't buy it, and just flip around and look at those pages and enjoy the erudition that he does offer. And then meanwhile, study the true masters of writing, break them down the way Joan Didion did Ernest Hemingway. In my book, Elements of Writing, I identify 81 very specific, simple tools and maneuvers you could use, and every one uses a case study from a great writer. Or a great piece of writing. So it's not like this is what I know. It's really more what the masters show you. But that's really the way to learn. It's to break down the people who are truly wonderful, figure out what their maneuvers are, try out those maneuvers. If they work for you, then put them into your repertoire. If they don't work for you, find somebody else. Keep reading, and then reverse engineering, breaking it down, seeing what little tricks of the trade are that you borrow, people who are truly masters of the craft of writing.
Alex, a final comment from you. And also, do you think that, it seems since you're a bit more negative than Charlie is on the idea of manuals, do you think, what would your, say, ideal writing manual be like?
Well, let me start with your question before I give closing thoughts. One thing that I've been thinking about, perhaps in my own writing or somebody else to do in the future, something I mentioned earlier, an ideal writing manual might very well be, let's say it's something that's geared towards fiction. It might very well be a writing guide embedded within a novel, or a novel embedded within a writing guide. As the book progresses, as the story unfolds, the author should comment upon why certain things work, why certain things would not work, why he decided to do a piece of dialogue in a particular way as opposed to all the other choices that he had to choose from. As this happens, you have a completely sort of, consistent work that obeys the logic of its own universe. And because it obeys the logic of its own universe, you're never put, as the author of this guide, into the position of creating a series of abstract rules that cannot logically apply elsewhere, because what works in Moby Dick would not necessarily work in every other book, and vice versa. If you limit yourself to the universe of a single piece of great fiction, however, any sort of rules you come up with, by applying them merely to that and only that, you can also kind of paradoxically allow it to kind of blossom outwards. And if you really kind of know what you're reading or know what you're talking about, you see how these ideas might apply to other books, in ways that would not necessarily apply here. I think long term, that's probably the best thing to do as far as making a style guide. And I'd also like to just sort of add to something that Charlie says in his essay. At some point, he says that to tap into a person's writing potential, you have to come to terms with the fact that each and every one of us, we have some sort of inborn, if not talent, then at least ability to think or to kind of give out a narrative. We all have narrative within us, and I think that's absolutely true. We all do have narrative within us. When we look at our life, we clearly try to piece things together chronologically. We try to find patterns in things that happen to us and things that happen to other people. We see patterns in our relationships. We see why we might do the things that we do over and over again, and why we might avoid other behaviors. At the same time, if you're going to say that we all have narrative within us, by that same token, also stands to reason that everybody has the same sort of blueprint and makeup that allows this kind of narrative to thrive. And if that is the case, if everybody has a sort of same stuff that forces us into narrative thinking, it also means that when they try to express this narrative thinking, it will follow patterns that in and of themselves are antithetical to art. These are patterns that are, for example, cliches. These are patterns that take form of expressions that people have heard many, many times over and over and over again, that now they sort of reuse simply by virtue of the fact that they heard it. So every narrative that we have within us, this is absolutely true. This is why, great writing sort of speaks to people, on a level that's also, quite neural in a sense. But you also have to be aware of the fact that, because we are all the product of a kind of blueprint, and this blueprint might vary in certain ways from person to person, we have the same kind of pitfalls, and we will all, in this kind of mnemonic sense, try to eventually regress to the mean. And any kind of regression to the mean when it comes to the art is a death sentence. When it comes to true expression, true writing, as far as, doing it at the highest level possible, regression to the mean is, it's over. You are done before you even start.
Well, I want to thank Charlie and Alex for their comments on Steven Pinker's book. As I said, I'll link to both of their websites and the two essays that were discussed here. So thanks again to both of you.
Thank you.